This is Foula, a lonely island in the North Atlantic, with no public electricity grid and no significant natural resources. It is almost entirely surrounded by towering sea cliffs, leaving seemingly no way out. Yet Foula is considered one of the most desirable places to live in the world. It is home to charming Shetland ponies that look as though they have stepped out of a fairy tale. It is also where about 30 descendants of the Vikings continue to hold on, just as their ancestors urged them to do more than 5,000 years ago. Using the simplest of means, they generate electricity from the wind and the sun in ways that even scientists would find hard to imagine. How have they built a life here that leaves thousands of people wishing they could do the same? The answer is probably not what you expect. Foula lies in isolation on the western edge of the Shetland Islands, part of Scotland and the United Kingdom. From above, it appears as a small piece of land surrounded by the North Atlantic, stretching about 5.6 kilometers in length, less than 4 kilometers in width, with a total area of only about 12.65 square kilometers. Amid the vast surrounding ocean, Foula looks like a place completely separated from the modern world. The distance between Foula and mainland is just over 30 kilometers. On a map, it seems remarkably short. But crossing it still means facing strong winds, rough seas, and the constantly changing weather of the North Atlantic. The closer you get to Foula, the quieter and more remote the landscape becomes. Surrounded by the open sea, the island comes into view with its grassy hillsides and a handful of small houses tucked into the lower ground. Along the eastern coast, no bridge has ever spanned those waters, and no tunnel has ever been built beneath the sea to connect Foula with the world beyond the waves. The people of the island rely only on ferries and airplanes, and both are ultimately at the mercy of the weather, not human schedules. A single spell of strong winds is enough to halt the ferry service. A lingering blanket of fog can render the grass airstrip unusable. When that happens, the islanders have no way to receive supplies, no way to reach the hospital, and no way to take their children to school on mainland. All they can do is wait, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for an entire week, until the sky and the sea finally allow travel again. Across those more than 12 square kilometers, only 30 people live, scattered through days of waiting like these. For them, the distance to the rest of the world is no longer measured in kilometers, but in the number of days they must wait for the next ferry to arrive. The calm of Foula's eastern coast quickly gives way to a completely different island. The farther west you travel, the more dramatic the landscape becomes. The ground begins to rise with one steep hillside after another before plunging abruptly into the sea as towering walls of rock. At the center of the island, Sneug, rising 418 meters, stands as Foula's highest peak. Farther west, the cliffs of Kame, reaching about 376 meters, rise almost vertically above the Atlantic Ocean and rank among the highest and most spectacular sea cliffs in the United Kingdom. Standing atop these rocky heights, nothing remains to block the view. Only the ocean stretches endlessly toward the horizon, while waves crash relentlessly against the base of the cliffs below. With no mountain ranges or large land masses to shelter it, Foula takes the full force of the Atlantic winds. The gusts sweep across the grassy hillsides, pressing the vegetation flat against the ground. While rain, fog, and rough seas can arrive at any moment, in the course of a single day, clear blue skies can give way to dark storm clouds, and the island's highest peaks can disappear behind a blanket of dense mist. Yet this seemingly unforgiving landscape has also become one of the United Kingdom's most important havens for wildlife. When the breeding season begins, the once quiet cliffs are transformed into a vast city of seabirds. Fulmars glide effortlessly along the wind currents, taking advantage of the very gales that people try to avoid, soaring with barely a wing beat. Just below them, Atlantic puffins burrow into the soft soil of the grassy slopes, while on the narrow rock ledges rows of guillemots and razorbills stand packed so closely together that it is almost impossible to tell one bird from another. And the most aggressive of them all is the great skua, known locally as the bonxie, the undisputed ruler of the skies, ready to dive bomb anyone who ventures too close to its nesting grounds. The cries of the birds blend with the sound of the wind and crashing waves, creating a chorus that never truly falls silent throughout the summer. Offshore, life continues beyond the cliffs. If you are fortunate enough to visit Foula on a calm day, you may spot gray seals resting on rocky outcrops directly from the cliff tops. Or pods of dolphins suddenly appearing across the surface of the sea. Farther offshore, several species of whales regularly pass through the waters surrounding the island during their migrations. Making the seas around Foula one of the most rewarding places to observe marine wildlife. Foula is also known for the Foula pony, one of Scotland's rarest native pony breeds. Their ancestors are believed to have arrived with the Vikings more than 1,000 years ago. After centuries of living with powerful winds, harsh winters, and limited food, they gradually adapted into small but remarkably hardy animals. Capable of finding their own food on the island's hillsides throughout the year, with almost no human care. On land, Foula is also home to about 1,000 sheep. From a distance, they appear as countless tiny white dots scattered across the hillsides, weaving through peat bogs and grazing in places too steep or too barren for people to farm. If you had the chance, would you choose to spend a few days surrounded by untamed nature? Or take a vacation in a modern city? Let us know your choice in the comments below. And now, let's discover the lives of the people who have chosen to call this isolated island home for generations. If nature is the main character on Foula, then the people who live here are like one large family, sharing a life in the middle of the ocean. Today, the entire island is home to only about 30 residents, spread across roughly 15 to 20 households. Nearly everyone knows one another by name, knows where each person lives, and understands the circumstances of every family. On an island this small, the idea of being merely neighbors almost disappears, because the whole community has become a close-knit group connected through generations. Life on Foula is also very different from life in a modern town or city. Instead of holding just one job, most residents have to take on several roles at once. Someone might tend sheep in the morning, serve as a member of the island's volunteer fire crew in the afternoon, and spend the evening repairing a broken water pipe for the family next door. Despite having only a few dozen residents, Foula still maintains a small primary school and a church called Baxter Chapel in the center of the island. The post office, which might be expected to serve as the community shop, actually sells only a few postcards and small souvenirs. The island school teaches children only until around the age of 12. After that, they must leave their families and attend boarding school at Anderson High School in Lerwick, returning to the island only during school holidays. Those years spent studying away from home give them the chance to experience a much wider world and form new relationships. Many later marry people from outside the island before choosing to return home. For most people, forgetting to buy something simply means a quick drive to the nearest supermarket. On Foula, it is a very different story. The island has no supermarket, no restaurants, and not even a gas station. Even everyday essentials such as milk, flour, and canned goods must travel across dozens of kilometers of open sea before reaching the island. Most food and supplies arrive from mainland Shetland on the scheduled ferry. Because sailings each week are limited and always depend on the weather, the people of Foula are accustomed to planning their shopping days or even weeks in advance. When rough seas or strong winds prevent the ferry from docking, they rely on whatever they have already stored at home until the next delivery can reach the island. Yet that dependence does not mean the people of Foula rely entirely on the mainland. Over generations, they have learned to make use of nearly every resource the island provides. The first is fresh water. Life on Foula is sustained by the steady rainfall that defines this part of Scotland. Rainwater collects in natural reservoirs high on the hills before flowing down into the valleys as crystal clear streams. That water not only supplies every home on the island, but is also used to power a small hydroelectric turbine, working together with wind and solar energy to help Foula generate its own electricity. They are also remarkably self-sufficient when it comes to fresh food. Even if you came here for a 2-week stay, the island could comfortably provide what you needed. Surrounding the houses are polycrubs, polycarbonate greenhouses developed specifically in Shetland to withstand winds of nearly 200 kilometers per hour. Inside, residents grow lettuce, cabbage, carrots, potatoes, and a variety of seasonal vegetables, providing fresh produce throughout the year. To earn the money needed for fuel and other essential supplies from the mainland, Foula's economy depends almost entirely on traditional sheep farming. On this rugged island, about 1,000 sheep form the backbone of the local economy. Each year, when it is time to sell the flock, the islanders undertake a demanding journey, transporting their sheep across dozens of kilometers of cold sea to the livestock market on mainland. Every sheep sold is exchanged for the cash, fuel, and everyday necessities they need to prepare for the long winter months ahead. Closely tied to those sheep and to the island's isolated way of life is a transportation system unlike any other. Although Foula is less than 6 kilometers long, old vehicles remain essential for traveling between the island's farms. But once a vehicle arrives on Foula, it almost never leaves again. In the middle of the Atlantic, waiting for replacement parts from the mainland is simply not practical. So, when a vehicle is damaged beyond repair, it is left where it stands, becoming a permanent open-air supply of spare parts. Over the years, other residents gradually remove its tires, mirrors, radiators, and whatever else can be reused to keep their own vehicles running. Survival has taught them never to waste anything. From these simple ingredients, the people of Foula continue to preserve a dish that has long been part of Shetland's history of survival. Reestate mutton. The mutton is salted and then hung in the loft, where the smoke rising from the peat fire below slowly dries and flavors the meat over the course of several weeks. On Foula, a pot of reestate mutton simmering on the stove carries the story of a fairy that arrived the week before, vegetables freshly picked from the polycrub, and a sheep that spent the entire summer grazing on the island's hillsides. Living on an isolated island also means that it is impossible to simply run a power line across the sea from the mainland. Foula is completely disconnected from the national grid, so all the electricity used by its residents must be generated on the island itself. Today, Foula operates an independent energy system that combines wind turbines, a small hydroelectric generator, solar panels, and battery storage. These energy sources are connected through a microgrid, a local power network responsible for distributing and balancing electricity across every household on the island. This solution is especially well suited to Foula. The strong winds that blow throughout the year provide an abundant natural source of energy, while small streams flowing down from the hills supply additional power to the hydroelectric system. When electricity production exceeds demand, the surplus energy is stored in batteries for use during periods of weaker winds or overcast weather. Thanks to this system, even though they live dozens of kilometers from the mainland, residents still have electricity to light their homes, preserve food, and operate the island's essential facilities. But that independence also has its limits. In some years, all three of the island's wind turbines have failed at the same time. One powerful storm once bent the blades, while a fault in a high-voltage cable forced the entire system offline. With no turbines and not enough hydroelectric power to support the whole island, the people of Foula had to rely on backup diesel generators, operating them manually for weeks while waiting for replacement parts to be sent from Northern Ireland to mainland Shetland, and then transported across the sea to the island. Each time this happens, a minor problem on the mainland can turn into weeks of power disruption on Foula. Foula has no resident doctor. When someone needs emergency medical care, the first call is not for an ambulance, but for the Coast Guard rescue helicopter based at Sumburg, dozens of kilometers away. Even then, it can only take off if the weather allows. The aircraft serving Foula is the Britain-Norman BN-2 Islander, a twin-engine propeller plane that carries about 8 to 9 passengers. The flight takes less than 20 minutes, but it depends entirely on the wind, low cloud, and visibility. If any one of those conditions is unfavorable, the flight is canceled immediately, with no alternative available. The ferry service is little different. During the winter, it operates only about 2 sailings each week, increasing to 3 during the calmer summer months. Every time the ferry arrives, it brings almost everything the island needs to sustain daily life. Strong winds keep the airplane on the ground. Heavy seas keep the ferry in port, sometimes for days at a time. In one year, insurance requirements related to the temporary closure of the island's fire station resulted in all flights to Foula being suspended for several months, leaving the ferry as the island's only connection to the outside world. The people of Foula have grown accustomed to checking the weather forecast every day, stocking up on supplies, and organizing their lives according to the schedule of the sea rather than the calendar. Every household keeps enough supplies on hand for the days when neither the ferry nor the airplane can reach the island. And whenever travel or deliveries are interrupted, neighbors knock on one another's doors, bringing extra food to share or offering a helping hand to repair a roof damaged by the wind. If there is one thing that has bound the people of Foula together for hundreds of years, it is not only the island's isolation, but also crofting, a traditional way of life that has existed for centuries across the northern islands of Scotland. Unlike modern farms operated with large-scale machinery, a croft is usually only a small plot of land managed by a single family. Here, residents combine sheep farming with growing potatoes, vegetables, and other crops suited to the cold climate, while making use of natural grazing land to sustain their livestock. The goal is not large-scale production, but to create a sustainable way of life that can support both the family and the community. But what makes crofting special is not the size of the land or the farming methods. It is the spirit of working together. That spirit is most clearly seen each summer, when the sheep's thick coats become too hot and heavy. This is when nearly the entire island takes part in Sheep Shearing Day, a tradition that has been maintained for generations. From early morning, flocks are driven in from hillsides across the island to a central gathering area. Adults, young people, and children all take part. One group holds the sheep still, Another uses shears to remove the thick layers of wool, while in a corner of the yard the freshly shorn fleeces are rolled and sorted by color. No one stands apart from the shared work. Over those few short days, around 1,000 sheep across the island are shorn one after another. The work continues without pause, but it is also filled with laughter and stories shared between generations. Stories about the year's harvest, a sheep that wandered onto a cliff the week before, or which child is being trusted with the shears for the first time that year. When the work is finished, everyone gathers around a shared meal in the yard, with the smell of sheep's wool still clinging to their sleeves. No one calculates wages, and no one keeps a record of how many times one person has helped another throughout the year. Before Viking sails appeared on the horizon, Foula was no longer a completely uninhabited island. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of stone tools, ancient house foundations, and other remains showing that people had reached the island as early as the Bronze Age and Iron Age. Although those first communities left few written records, the archaeological evidence proves that Foula had been known to humans for thousands of years. The true turning point came around the year 800, when Viking ships from Norway crossed the North Sea, reached Shetland, and then landed on Foula, establishing the first permanent settlement on the island. It was the Vikings who named the island Fuglaey, meaning Bird Island in Old Norse. The name was no coincidence. Even from a distance, they could see the cliffs covered with seabirds during the breeding season, a sight so striking that it came to define the entire island. Over hundreds of years of linguistic change, Fuglaey gradually became Foula, the name still used today. The seabirds may have been the first thing to catch their attention, but to remain and build homes, the Vikings needed more than a beautiful sight. The island's grasslands were extensive enough to support sheep through the harsh winter. The waters around Foula were rich in fish, enough to sustain a small community throughout the year. And from this western edge of Shetland, a ship could not only find shelter from storms, but also continue farther toward Orkney, Iceland, or the Faroe Islands. The first families built their homes on the low ground in the east of the island and released their sheep onto the surrounding slopes. When the elders of the household died, they were buried on the same land that, only a short time before, the family had believed would be no more than a temporary stop. A place once seen only from the deck of a ship now held the graves of the Vikings themselves. More than 1,000 years have passed since the first Viking ships reached Foula. The Norse warriors have long since disappeared into history, but the island has never truly lost what they left behind. The people still call their mountains, valleys, and headlands by names rooted in Old Norse. Da Sneug, da Kame, Ham, and even smaller places such as Norderhus, Fuglaey, and Gutrin still bear names that have survived for centuries. The language of the Vikings also endured here longer than almost anywhere else. For centuries, the people of Foula spoke Norn, a descendant of Old Norse that was once heard throughout Shetland and Orkney. Most of the islands abandoned Norn much earlier, but Foula's isolation delayed its disappearance. People here continued to speak the language until the late 18th century, and perhaps even into the early 19th century. That influence can also be seen in the way the islanders observe time. While the rest of the country adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, Foula continued to celebrate Christmas and New Year according to the old Julian calendar. Christmas falls on January 6th, and New Year on January 13th, 12 days later than in the rest of the United Kingdom. We will explore the story behind these celebrations in greater detail later. The island's untouched character also once drew the attention of filmmakers. In 1936, director Michael Powell brought a film crew to Foula and lived alongside the islanders for 4 months while making The Edge of the World. Released in 1937, the film brought Foula's towering cliffs and its small community in the middle of the ocean to the screen for the first time. Foula's Viking heritage does not sit behind museum glass. A child calls the hill behind their home by a name that is 1,000 years old. A Yule dinner is served 12 days later than in the rest of Britain. A black and white film, shot nearly 90 years ago, shows the faces of Foula's own people appearing on screen for the first time. All of it remains here, not inside a museum, but within the island's everyday rhythm of life. So what is it that keeps them here? For many of Foula's residents, the island has never been just a place to live. It is home where generations of the same families have grown up among the cliffs, the grasslands, and the sea. Life on the island is far from easy. Services are limited, jobs are scarce, and many of the conveniences people take for granted on the mainland simply do not exist here. But in return, Foula offers something that has become increasingly precious in the modern world: peace. On Foula, everyone knows one another. A roof needs repairing, A flock of sheep needs to be gathered, or supplies need to be carried from the harbor. That is all it takes for others to show up and help. That sense of community is not built on rules or obligations. It has grown naturally through generations of people sharing the same life in the middle of the sea. Many residents, even after leaving the island to study or work elsewhere, eventually return because Foula is where they feel they belong. Not because it is a perfect place, but because it is where their families, their memories, and the values that have shaped their lives remain. Still, the numbers tell an unavoidable story. By the late 19th century, Foula's population had reached a peak of about 267 people. Today, only about 30 remain. Every time a family leaves, the community grows a little smaller. And on an island that has lost nearly 9/10 of its population over the course of more than a century, every person who chooses to stay carries part of the responsibility for keeping this place alive. Foula continues to evolve. Renewable energy systems, gradual improvements to its infrastructure, and a small number of newcomers drawn by the very things others avoid, a slower pace of life, an untamed landscape, and a community so small that every individual truly matters, are helping to ensure that the island continues to thrive. Perhaps one day, Foula will have more people than it does today, or perhaps fewer. But as long as one family chooses to stay instead of leaving, and as long as one child grows up knowing how to find the way home through the island's fog, that small island in the North Atlantic will always have someone who calls it home.